They were supposed to spend their lives behind bars, but one by one, they walked out of prison and vanished into the world like ghosts. These are the killers who looked straight into the eyes of judges, psychologists, and parole boards and convinced them they had changed. Smiling, calm, harmless, and the system believed every word. What came next would shock entire communities. Imagine passing someone in a grocery store, sitting next to someone on a bus, or living right beside a quiet neighbor, and never knowing that they once ended a life. These aren't escape stories. These are cases where the justice system opened the door and let them walk free. Some slipped through legal cracks. Some were released early for good behavior. And some manipulated the system so perfectly, it still haunts investigators today. In this video, we uncover 20 terrifying killers who were released from prison, the ones who should have never seen freedom again. Their stories will make you question how many more are still out there, blending into crowds, starting new lives, and hiding in plain sight. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones the system trusted the most. The first group of killers on this list all share one thing in common. They walked out of prison not because they escaped, but because the system itself opened the door. Their freedom wasn't stolen, it was granted. And the consequences of those decisions still echo through the lives of victims' families who believed justice had been served. One of the most shocking examples is the case of a man who was originally sentenced to decades behind bars for a brutal killing that shook his entire town. But as the years passed, his behavior inside prison began to shift. He stayed quiet. He avoided conflict. He attended every rehabilitation class offered. On paper, he looked like a changed man. By the time his parole hearing arrived, officers described him as model inmate material. But what no one realized was that his silence wasn't reform, it was strategy. He had simply learned how to play the system. And when he walked out of prison, he didn't return to society as a reformed man. Instead, he disappeared, resurfacing only when new crimes with his old signature began to emerge. Another terrifying case involves a woman convicted of killing her partner in a violent attack. She was given a long sentence, yet due to prison overcrowding, her early release was approved under a routine policy that prioritized non-repeat offenders. No psychological analysis, no risk assessment, just paperwork. Within a year of her release, she struck again during an argument, proving that her first crime was never an isolated moment of rage. It was who she truly was. Throughout these stories, a disturbing pattern becomes clear. Parole boards often rely on limited information, quick evaluations, or outdated risk assessment tools. On the outside, these killers appear calm, cooperative, even remorseful. But remorse can be faked, and cooperation costs nothing when freedom is the reward. Experts have admitted repeatedly that predicting violent reoffending is still one of the most difficult challenges in criminal psychology. Even more unsettling are the cases where killers convinced prison counselors they had found religion, or discovered inner peace, or experienced a personal awakening. These transformations sounded good in reports, and courts loved hearing success stories. But for some, it was just performance, words crafted to win trust. Families of victims often say they felt blindsided when they learned the person who took their loved one's life was suddenly free. No warning, no explanation, just a short letter or a quick phone call telling them the killer was no longer behind bars. And for many, it felt like their trauma had been repeated all over again. Outline 1 reveals the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the justice system doesn't fail because of a lack of evidence or weak laws. It fails because it chooses to believe the wrong people. And the killers who take advantage of that trust are often the ones who know exactly how to hide their darkness. The next set of killers didn't just walk free because the system was weak. They walked free because they were brilliant at pretending to be someone they weren't. These are the manipulators, the smooth talkers, the ones who understood exactly what psychologists, judges, and parole officers wanted to hear. Their crimes were horrifying, but their ability to deceive was even more chilling. One case that stands out involves a man who committed a violent killing in his early 20s. While behind bars, he became a master of self-presentation. He read psychology books, practiced emotional responses, and rehearsed stories of childhood trauma that made him appear broken rather than dangerous. During evaluations, he spoke softly, maintained eye contact, and displayed just the right balance of remorse and maturity. By the time he faced the parole board, he appeared transformed, calm, thoughtful, even spiritual. Experts were convinced he had undergone a genuine change, but once released, he returned to the same patterns of violence, proving that every step of his rehabilitation was nothing more than a scripted performance. Another disturbing example involves a woman convicted of a cold, calculated murder. Inside prison, she became known for her charisma. She befriended staff, volunteered in programs, and even helped mediate disputes among other inmates. Reports praised her leadership and emotional growth. What no one realized was that she was studying people, their reactions, their weaknesses, their expectations. She crafted a personality that impressed everyone. When she was recommended for early release, no one objected. But within months of regaining her freedom, she orchestrated another violent attack, showing the world that her charm was only a mask, hiding a deeply dangerous mind. These cases highlight a terrifying truth. Manipulation can be more powerful than remorse. Many killers released under these circumstances knew exactly what psychological tests measured. They understood how remorse was supposed to sound. They learned how to mimic empathy, how to control facial expressions, and how to make their stories convincing. And because authorities are trained to look for signs of improvement, they were eager to believe change was possible. In many of these situations, investigators later admitted that something had felt off, but not enough to stop release. A few parole officers even described feeling uneasy during interviews, yet couldn't identify a clear reason. Some killers displayed overly polished behavior, almost too perfect. But without concrete evidence of deception, the system moved forward. What makes these stories even more haunting is that many of the released killers blended seamlessly back into society. They got jobs, made friends, attended events, and behaved like ordinary people, while carrying the same violent tendencies they had always possessed. Their new crimes often came as a shock to everyone around them because their public persona seemed completely harmless. Outline 2 exposes the dark reality that the most dangerous killers aren't always the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes, they're the ones who smile, speak gently, and say exactly what you want to hear, right before they strike again. The third category of killers didn't walk free because they were charming, or because they behaved well. They walked free because of something far more frightening: loopholes, paperwork errors, and technicalities so small that a single missing signature or misfiled document became the difference between justice and release. These are cases where the system didn't just misjudge danger, it accidentally unlocked the cage and let predators slip through. One of the most unsettling examples involves a man convicted of a brutal, cold-blooded murder. His sentence was long enough that no one expected to see him outside again. But during a routine review, someone discovered an error in how the original sentence had been calculated. A clerical mistake, buried deep inside a thick stack of legal files, resulted in his term being dramatically reduced. By the time the error was caught, the law required his release. Neighbors were stunned when he returned home, but the true horror came months later when he disappeared and investigators linked him to a second violent crime. Another disturbing case centers on a killer who was awaiting retrial after a witness refused to return to testify. Without that crucial testimony, prosecutors had almost no evidence left. Instead of holding him longer or seeking alternative charges, the legal system simply let him go. He stepped out of the courthouse a free man, smiling at reporters, behaving as if everything had been a misunderstanding. But the smile vanished after his release, replaced by the same darkness that had defined him before. When a new victim was found years later, the pattern was unmistakable. The system had handed him a second chance to kill. There are also cases where killers benefited from outdated policies that hadn't been rewritten in decades. One murderer walked free because the law at the time required automatic sentence reduction for inmates who worked certain jobs in prison. It didn't matter what they had done on the outside. The rule applied equally to all. This man kept his head down, took the easiest job available, and quietly earned his freedom day by day, hour by hour. The moment he was released, he slipped into another city under a new identity, using that loophole as his escape route. Even more terrifying are situations where poor communication between agencies led to quiet releases. One killer was supposed to be transferred to another state to face new charges after serving his sentence, but a breakdown in communication meant no one arrived to pick him up. The prison, believing he was no longer required to stay, released him. By the time authorities realized the mistake, he was long gone. Outline 3 shows the most chilling truth of all. Sometimes, killers don't manipulate the system. The system fails on its own. A missed phone call, a lost file, a rewritten law, or a rushed decision becomes a doorway to freedom. And once these killers slip through that doorway, the consequences can last a lifetime. The 4th category of killers is the most terrifying of all, because these are the ones who didn't just return to violence after release. They became even more dangerous. Their time in prison didn't weaken them. It hardened them. It sharpened them. It taught them how to hide their impulses, how to study people, and how to pick their next victims more carefully. When they walked out of those gates, they weren't rehabilitated. They were upgraded predators. One chilling case involves a man who had committed a violent killing in a moment of rage. Authorities believed it was a one-time explosion, an emotional breakdown rather than a pattern. He completed counseling programs, stayed quiet, and convinced everyone he was stable. But once free, he didn't return to a normal life. Instead, he isolated himself, slowly slipping back into dark thoughts until he finally acted again, this time with more planning, more cruelty, and more confidence. The second crime revealed something investigators had missed. Prison had not extinguished his violence. It had simply paused it. Another case involves a gang-affiliated killer known for his cold, calculated methods. He was released early due to sentencing guidelines, despite warnings from officers who had seen his escalating behavior behind bars. They claimed he was becoming more strategic, more patient, more cunning. But guidelines are guidelines, and once his time was up, he walked. Within months, authorities saw a spike in gang-related violence. Victims described a masked man with the same tattoo pattern, the same movement style. It wasn't long before investigators realized the truth. The killer they had watched evolve inside prison was now using his new skills on the outside. Then there are those whose violence escalated because they felt they had outsmarted the system. One released murderer openly bragged to acquaintances that prison hadn't changed him, it had educated him. He learned how investigators think, how evidence is traced, and how killers get caught. He studied his mistakes, so when he committed another crime, it was nearly impossible to trace. He had used prison as a training ground and freedom as the stage for his next act. Some killers grew more violent because release fueled their resentment. They felt the world owed them something. They believed they had been wrongfully imprisoned or mistreated. So instead of returning quietly to society, they lashed out. In one case, a man who served years for homicide was released after a successful appeal. His first action wasn't rebuilding his life, it was hunting down the person who had testified against him. That attack confirmed investigators' worst fear. His motives were no longer just about rage or impulse, they were about revenge. Outline 4 exposes a disturbing reality. Some killers don't mellow with time. They evolve. Prison becomes a place to think, plan, and prepare. And when the system misjudges their transformation and sets them free, they step into the world not weaker, but stronger, and far more lethal. The final category of killers is perhaps the most unsettling of all, not because of what they did inside prison, but because of what happened after they walked out. These are the killers who were released legally, quietly, without public notice, and then vanished. No address, no tracking, no follow-up supervision. They simply stepped into the world and disappeared into the crowd. And to this day, no one knows where they are, who they live beside, or whether they ever struck again. One of the most chilling examples involves a man who had been convicted of a brutal homicide decades earlier. When he completed his sentence, he checked out of the prison with a bag of clothes, a few dollars, and instructions to report to a halfway center. He never arrived. Instead, he boarded a bus in a completely different direction. Authorities issued a message asking for information, but there was no active manhunt. He had served his time. Technically, he wasn't a fugitive. Years later, investigators believe he may have assumed a new identity in another state. Some even suspect he could be responsible for a series of unsolved attacks, each matching details from his old case. Another disturbing case concerns a woman who had a long history of violent behavior. She was released under an outdated policy that required no long-term monitoring. Officially, she was supposed to sign in weekly, but after her first check-in, she stopped showing up. Documentation was slow, and by the time authorities realized she was missing, months had passed. She had already crossed 2 borders, moving under false names. Rumors surfaced of violent incidents in countries she passed through, but nothing was ever proven. Her trail faded, leaving behind only questions. Even more haunting are the killers who slip into new communities as if they never had a past. One man relocated to a small rural town after completing his sentence. Locals described him as quiet and polite. No one knew his background. No one questioned his sudden arrival. Then, without warning, he vanished from the community, leaving behind an empty apartment and a few personal items. Shortly afterward, authorities in another state reported a disturbing crime scene with details eerily similar to his old methods. But with no confirmed sightings, his whereabouts remain unknown, and investigators fear he may still be drifting from place to place. Some disappeared killers are believed to have changed their identities entirely. New documents, new cities, even new countries. Since many regions lack international coordination for tracking released offenders, once they slip through the cracks, they become ghosts, free to move, free to blend, free to hide. A few have even started new families, living normal lives on the surface, while their dark history remains buried in distant court files. Outline 5 closes with the most terrifying possibility. Somewhere out there, released killers are living ordinary lives among ordinary people. Neighbors, co-workers, the person sitting across from you in a coffee shop. They served their sentences, walked out legally, and disappeared. And unless they strike again, the world may never know who they really are.